seemingly ordinary family trip. I won't tell you where. I won't tell you when. The main thing is that it was the time of my youth. A time when the world seemed simple and understandable, and life promised only a bright future. At that time, my parents, my sister, and I moved into an old, rather secluded house on the outskirts of a small community. The house was old, yes, that's for sure, but there was something attractive about him. It was incredibly spacious, with high ceilings and large windows through which sunlight penetrated, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The furnishings in the house were a little different, challenging. There was a lot of antique furniture, antique paintings on the walls, creating a sense of the presence of the past centuries. My parents assured me that it was vintage, that it gave the house charm. But for me, then still a teenager, it was more like a fancy museum storage. Every morning started the same way. The creaking of the parquet floor under my mother's feet as she went downstairs to prepare breakfast, the clink of dishes, my father's laughter joking about something on the radio, and of course the sonorous, bubbly laughter of my younger sister, Anne. Anne. My heart still aches at that name. She was a ray of light in our family, a little son who always tried to please everyone. She was only 10 when we moved in. She loved everything about the new house, especially her new room. It was large, overlooking a lush garden where old, sprawling trees bloomed in the wind, their branches creaking like someone's wrinkled fingers. But over time, the house began to bring a different feeling. It wasn't something explicit, specific, rather subtle, barely perceptible. The air seemed heavier, especially in the evenings. Sometimes I imagined quiet footsteps when it was just me and Anne in the house, and my parents were in town. But it was worth listening. Silence. Drafts, most likely, were explained by my parents and me. The old house, new windows, you know. Anne, however, began to say strange things. She told me about her doll. The doll was old, battered, with one lost glass eye. Anne didn't play with it the way she did with other toys. She just held it, talked to it in a whisper, put it to sleep next to her. My parents thought it was just a childhood fantasy, a consequence of being alone in a new place. That's what I thought too. But one day when I looked into her room late at night, I heard her whisper to the doll. She said that he won't let us rest. We have to calm him down. He's angry. It was unclear what or who he was. I went into the room and Anne turned away from the doll in fright. Who's there? What is it? No one, honey. It's just me. What are you doing here? I asked, trying to sound calm. I'm playing, she replied, too fast, too unnaturally. And the doll lying next to her seemed somehow alive. One of her eyes, a black pupil, seemed to be watching me. It was just my fear. I was calming myself down, but it settled somewhere inside, a thin piece of ice. Day after day, these feelings became more and more intrusive. The creaking increased at night. In the dark, I often heard a soft, barely perceptible chuckle that seemed to come from somewhere in the hallway, and sometimes from the very depths of the house. It seemed like someone was watching us, not a specific person, but the very atmosphere of this place was saturated with some kind of unknown to me feeling, either sadness or expectation. Parents kept saying that it was the stress of moving, childhood fears, but Anne became more and more withdrawn. Her cheeks paled, and her eyes acquired a kind of faded depth despite her childish age. She rarely smiled. She often sat alone, clutching that old doll to her, as if trying to find protection in it from something invisible, but very real. One day, I discovered her diary that had accidentally fallen out of a bookcase. There were a lot of ordinary children's notes, but a few pages stood out for their eeriness. She wrote about how he wakes up at night, how he tells her scary things, about the fact that her doll is the only one who understands her, who can come to an agreement with him. She called the doll Annabelle. Annabelle knows how to make it quieter, she wrote. I've never seen this doll when it was lying in the room, but now that I knew her name, I felt even more uneasy. At that moment, I still didn't realize how deeply we were immersed in this game, this reality that the house itself dictated to us, using, as I naively assumed at the time, my sister's childish imagination. He's angry. I heard her soft, broken whisper again behind the closed door, when one evening I was trying to catch on the clock the exact time of the onset of complete, absolute loneliness in this old house. The sun had long since set behind the horizon, casting shadows on the walls of the room that distorted familiar objects, making them look like writhing silhouettes. I stood on the threshold of her room, my hand paused on the doorknob. At first, I just wanted to check if everything was okay, but hearing her words, something inside me made me stop. She was talking to someone or something. Not to my parents, not to me, not to any other child. It was an intimate, fearful conversation, and the doll Annabelle was his only listener. My parents, completely oblivious to the invisible crack that was slowly but surely growing in the family idyll, lived in their own world of worries. My father stayed late at work, and my mother spent more and more time embroidering and reading old books, trying to find answers to what I later realized were her own fears, which she hid under a mask of calmness. Realizing that I had to take on the role of a kind of protector for my younger sister, I began to observe her more closely, trying to find a logical explanation for her changed behavior. It seemed to me that it was just a reaction to stress, to the absence of former friends, to an alien environment. I was looking for any rational reasons that could reassure myself, if not her. And that's when I started noticing oddities not only in Anne's behavior, but also in life at home. Accidents that seemed less and less random. I'm not talking about some mystical coincidences, but about a series of unpleasant events that, like one chain, intertwined into a gloomy picture. In the morning, I might find that all my books from the school library were shuffled on the shelf, although the day before, I remembered exactly how carefully I arranged them alphabetically. Sometimes when the parents left, the closet doors and windows started opening and closing in the house. The sounds were quiet, ordinary, the kind that could be produced by drafts. But it happened too often, too naturally. It seemed like someone was purposely playing out some small, invisible performance that was designed precisely to confuse me. I was getting nervous, spending more and more time making sure the windows and doors were securely closed before going to bed. I felt like I was living under the scrutiny of someone invisible but still present. This feeling was worse than an open threat. It was bordering on paranoia. Anne, however, became more and more innocent. She stopped talking about her scary stranger. Instead, she began to show an unusual tendency to self-flagellation. At first, it was insignificant, when she said that she was to blame for her own minor failures. Then her words began to take on a darker tone. Once, after breaking a glass of milk, she didn't cry, but clutching her hands to her chest in fright, said, "It was his will. I have to be punished." Her parents, gentle, loving people, began to worry a lot. They took her to a local doctor, but he just shrugged, talking about the immature child's psyche and the need for patience. And I felt like these words of the doctors were becoming for us, in our new reality, some kind of echo of my own ignorant hope for a successful outcome. Naivety on her face, There was a terrible, completely childish determination in her eyes, the calmness of a man who had learned a secret that far surpassed his years. "Do you see it too?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice low but full of authority. "What do I see?" I replied, trying to stay calm. "That he's here, that he wouldn't leave." Her gaze swept over the doll. "Only Annabelle knows how to please him." I realized that this old house, this new life, brought with it something deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't a child's game. It was a game of survival, and my only opponent was none other than this place, this old house, which seemed to be draining the life out of us, like from a dried-up well, using my unfortunate sister and this creepy doll for this. And this doll, Annabelle, who was just supposed to be a broken toy, suddenly became the centerpiece of everything that was happening. I felt that the moment was approaching when I would stop looking for explanations and be forced to accept this world as reality. "He's here. What does he want?" I repeated my question to Anne, trying to break through the armor of unnatural calm that surrounded her. My fingers tightly clutched a crumpled piece of paper with the mysterious symbols, feeling it as the only tangible contact with the sinister reality that seeped through my usual life. Her lips parted, but before she could say anything else, there was a soft knock downstairs. It wasn't loud, but to my recently heightened nerves, it sounded like a gunshot. It was a knock on the front door. Who could have come so late? I remember glancing at my watch quickly. It was late. At a time like this, only casual visitors dare to bother. Without raising the alarm, so as not to frighten my sister, I quietly left her room, closing the door back, but not closing it completely. Going down the creaking stairs seemed like an eternity to me then. There was a box on the landing in front of the door, in the faint light of a desk lamp. An ordinary cardboard box, without any identification marks. Who left it and why? There was nothing on the door handle, no marks, just cool, smooth metal. I looked around, hoping to see at least the silhouette of someone, but the streets were empty. The darkness outside the window seemed endless. When I returned to the house with the box, I took it to the kitchen. The coolness of the room was a little soothing. I opened the box under a dim light bulb. Inside, wrapped in coarse burlap, were several antique objects. The main one was an ancient, well-preserved carved wooden box covered with tarnished carvings depicting some strange spiral patterns. Next to it was a bunch of dried herbs gathered together with a tied thread, which gave off a pungent, unfamiliar smell that caused a slight headache. And at the very bottom is a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. And along with it all, there was another piece of paper, the same as the one I found at Anne's. The same symbols. The sun, the broken lines, the human figurine. My heart started beating faster. These things had no connection with our family, with our former home. I felt that I had crossed some line, that what was happening was beginning to go beyond simple childish behavior or my own experiences. These items, they looked like they were brought here for a specific purpose. I took the first letter and opened it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, with elaborate flourishes, but quite legible. And in the very first lines that I saw, Annabelle was mentioned. Not as a doll's name, but as a person's name. The letters were from someone named Ethan, who addressed a certain Eleanor. I began to read on, absorbing every word. These were personal diary entries telling about the difficulties of life, about hard work, about some long-standing but persistent problem related to family affairs, and strange as it may sound, with the very old house where we now lived. He wrote about the strange circumstances under which he received this box, how it ended up in his possession, and how he is now forced to get rid of it. He described how the objects inside seemed to demand attention, how they evoked dreams, made one feel as if someone else was present in the house. It was a torrent of fears mixed with a kind of dull despair. "He won't let it go," Anne's voice sounded behind me, and I shuddered. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, and now she had Annabelle in her arms. She held the doll like a jewel, as the only source of warmth in this cold reality. "We need to make sure that he doesn't get mad anymore," she added, and a shadow of smile flashed across her face, which was both sinister and unbearably sad. I felt a chill run through my skin. Ethan mentioned in his letters something similar to what Anne was saying just now, about the need to calm down a certain presence, that it was demanding and moody. He described how he felt constant pressure, as if something or someone wanted to oust him from his own home. I put the letters away. At that moment, I realized that my childhood fantasies and my fear had collided with something much more real and terrible, and my sister, Anne, became an unwitting participant in it. That evening, standing in the kitchen with Ethan's letters in my hands and seeing in my sister's eyes not a childish gleam, but a reflection of pain that someone had experienced for a long time, I realized that my own life had begun to change irreversibly. Ethan's words sounded like a prophecy, and his fear seemed like a harbinger of our own end. He wrote about how he lost sleep, how he began to see some images when he looked at antique objects from a box. He described the feeling as if they were constantly trying to squeeze him out of his own life, as if his personality and his memories were slowly being erased, leaving an empty space. His attempts to get rid of these things, this box, have only led to new, more disturbing phenomenon. He left the box on his doorstep, hoping that someone else would be her victim, someone who could find a solution where he himself had failed. Anne lifted the doll higher. "He's waiting," she said, and her gaze was fixed on the doorway, as if she saw someone there in the empty hallway. "You have to do as he wants. Only then will we be safe." There was no childish protest in her voice, just a cold calmness. In Ethan's letters, he mentioned something similar to what Anne was saying just now, about the need to calm down a certain presence, that it was demanding and moody. He described how he felt constant pressure, as if something or someone wanted to oust him from his own home. I put the letters away. At that moment, I realized that my childhood fantasies and my fear had collided with something much more real and terrible. At that time, my parents were somewhere in their own world, unaware that my children were trapped in their own reality created by the walls of the old house. I wanted to shout, to wake them up, to tell them everything, but what could I tell them? That my daughter is talking to a doll that is the central object of some kind of rituals? That a stranger, dead or missing, has left us a legacy of a whole tangle of psychological traumas expressed in the form of some kind of objects? I felt like I was getting pulled into this noose myself, like the house was starting to dictate its rules to me. I knew this story would end badly. Anne slowly lowered the doll, her fingers sliding over the tarnished fabric. "You need to find a way out," she whispered. And there was so much understanding in her voice, so much old age, that I was really scared. She looked at me as if she knew my whole future life, all my sufferings. At that moment, I realized that reality is much scarier than any mystical stories. It was the reality of despair, the reality of losing oneself, and the house was just a place where all this was happening, a cold and indifferent witness to our struggle. And Annabelle, she wasn't a ghost or a demon. She was just a symbol of the point where everyday life collided with the black truth of human despair. My own reality ended right there, in the kitchen, at that moment, when I realized that we would never be able to leave here unless we destroyed this house from the inside, and it could only be destroyed by taking away its main prey, its next victim. I realized that this would be my final, and it's not going to be a happy ending.